Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I would like to discuss some of the older, more manipulative ladies in Jane Austen. This video was inspired by Claudia from Spinster's Library and her amazing recent video about mean girls in Jane Austen, where she discusses and ranks some of the main characters' younger antagonists like Caroline Bingley or Isabella Thorpe. These girls often take advantage of or compete with our Austen heroine for control of the marriage market and to secure themselves a financial future of stability. But they are not the only ones who cause drama for the typical Austen heroine. Austen has a whole host of mean old broads. These older, domineering, intimidating matrons who greatly shape the plot of Austen's novels and the course of action for our heroine. Think of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice, butting her nose into rumors of Lizzie Bennet's marital business, or Mrs. Norris from Mansfield Park, ordering servants around and treating Fanny like a second-class citizen. So let's take a look at a few of these powerful, manipulative, intimidating, and quite honestly, terrifying women in Jane Austen's work, and think about what motivates them to be so darn mean. Just a brief word of warning, there will be spoilers in this video, and these women are not ranked. I am rubbish at ranking things when it comes to Austen's books and characters, so I leave it up to you to judge the actions of these 5 women. First up is Mrs. Churchill from Emma. Mrs. Churchill is Frank Churchill's aunt and surrogate mother, and though we never actually meet her in Emma, her reputation precedes her. Mrs. Churchill is known to rule Enscombe with an iron fist. In Emma, Mrs. Weston confesses that Mrs. Churchill has no more heart than a stone to people in general and a devil of a temper. We are told that she is so very unreasonable and everything gives way to her, and also that the Churchills are very jealous of Frank's regard for his father, Mr. Weston. We hear that Frank's trip to Highbury depends entirely on his aunt's spirits and pleasure. Mrs. Churchill rules at Enscombe and is a very odd-tempered woman, and his coming now depends upon her being willing to spare him. So Mrs. Churchill sounds like quite a lovely woman, wouldn't you say? Yeah, no, obviously she's not. She's a rather minor character in Emma, so minor that we never even meet her, but despite that, she has such an influence on the course of this book. She helped parent Frank Churchill and made him into the man he is. And the demands that she puts on Frank are probably the reason he is so estranged from his father. And she's definitely the reason that the book gives for Frank's sudden departure before the big ball he and Emma are planning, which quite vexes Emma. I find it hard to read into the character of Mrs. Churchill, any more than a demanding, cold personality and serious jealousy and possessiveness when it comes to Frank Churchill. But, of course, there would be no pretense of secret engagements if not for her, and the main plot twist in Emma would never happen if not for Mrs. Churchill. Next up is Mrs. Fanny Dashwood of Sense and Sensibility. She's the sister-in-law of Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood, and arguably without her, the entire plot of Sense and Sensibility wouldn't happen either. Mrs. Dashwood convinces her husband to accept a creative interpretation of his father's will, and what it means to support his stepmother and half-sisters. Mrs. Dashwood is so persuasive that Mr. John Dashwood changes his intentions of giving Marianne, Eleanor, and their mother £3,000 a year to simply offering occasional acts of goodwill, which basically amounts to nothing. Mrs. Dashwood, of course, carefully crafts her argument as a defense of her son. She would not see all the money destined for her poor little son go to these people who she considers such distant relations. The book implies that there's actually plenty of money to go around, but that Mrs. Dashwood is greedy and selfish. Between the commandeering way Mrs. Dashwood takes over Norland Park, her general vanity and snobbery, and the manner in which she convinces her husband to let his relations live in poverty, I find it quite difficult to redeem Mrs. Dashwood. And next I want to talk about Mrs. Norris from Mansfield Park. Mrs. Norris is Fanny's aunt, but she's rather cruel to Fanny in comparison to her other nieces, Maria and Julia. A lot of this stems from Mrs. Norris's relationship to her own sisters. Fanny's mother eloped for love, marrying a man that her family considers to have no consequence, wealth, or education. 11 years after Fanny's mother's estrangement, she reaches out to her sisters to ask for help and advice. Mrs. Norris offers to give Fanny Price a home, but she's not willing to take her in herself. Instead, she pawns the child off on her other sister, Mrs. Bertram. So Mrs. Norris gets all the credit for this benevolent idea and none of the child-rearing responsibilities. Then Mrs. Norris rejects Fanny a second time after the death of her husband, claiming that she is too bereft to take care of her. Mrs. Norris is generally nasty, and her running of the Bertrams' household has been compared to the behavior of a slave master. Mrs. Norris is most often seen criticizing Fanny or bullying and patronizing the servants. Social position is very important to Mrs. Norris, and by belittling others, she maintains herself as part of the upper class. As a clergyman's widow, Mrs. Norris occupies a really tenuous place in society. It's the same situation that Mrs. Bates is in Emma, only that Mrs. Norris has Mrs. Bertram to depend on. Mrs. Norris is also in a similar situation to Austen's own family after her father passed away, but obviously the Austens were never as cruel as Mrs. Norris. The point is that in comparison to the Bertrams, Mrs. Norris is the poor relation, but in exercising control over Fanny and keeping her present, Mrs. Norris is not the poorest relation. Part of me can't help but wonder if she also treats Fanny the way she does out of resentment for her mother's elopement. Mrs. Norris likes to see Fanny's mother's financially poor match as a humiliation and betrayal to the larger family. It does seem like some aspect of Mrs. Norris's relationship with Fanny's mother is being taken out on Fanny. But besides her cruelty to Fanny, Mrs. Norris does a few other things to prove that she is closer in status to Mrs. Bertram than Fanny. She plays a sort of surrogate mother role to her nieces, Maria and Julia, and even encourages Maria's financially favorable marriage to Mr. Rushworth. Mrs. Norris is quite a dislikable character, but the motives behind her behavior seem to be most interesting for me to explore, and frankly, the most understandable. Not that it excuses that behavior by any means. And, of course, I cannot talk about these women without mentioning Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Like Mrs. Norris, Lady Catherine is very conscious of class and her family's wealth and appearance to others. But Lady Catherine has even more of a reputation to protect since she has vastly more wealth than Mrs. Norris. She is rich, titled, and has a legacy to protect. She also seems much older than the other characters on this list, and the combination of her age and status demands respect. Lady Catherine is domineering, condescending, and really flat out rude to those she deems beneath her, which is almost everyone. She surrounds herself with people who listen to her advice or won't challenge her in any way. Her daughter Anne is sickly and meek. Mr. Collins practically worships her. She's used to people bending to her every whim and feels a sense of self-importance brought on by the privilege of her wealth. And so, when Lady Catherine hears a rumor that Elizabeth Bennet is engaged to Darcy, she goes to confront her and is shocked by Lizzie Bennet's audacity towards her. She's not used to that kind of treatment. Lizzie denies the engagement, but she also refuses to promise that she will never accept an engagement to Darcy. It's hard to tell if Lizzie's actions were out of spite for Lady Catherine's meddling or due to her yet unrecognized feelings for Darcy. But either way, Lizzie's stubbornness and strong will aggravate and worry Lady Catherine, whose sole mission in life is to be wealthy and important and continue that legacy on in the family. And last but not least is Lady Susan. Lady Susan is manipulative, conniving, and selfish. She's a terrible mother. Frederica, her daughter, is terrified of her, and Lady Susan is unwilling to listen to her daughter's concerns or opinions. Many of the mean old broads rationalize their actions in the disguise of protecting their family's class and reputation, or of acting in the best interests of their children. And while Lady Susan claims to do these things for her daughter Frederica's well-being, she's simply out for herself and her own advantages. Lady Susan is peculiar, though, because she's not seen as old despite having a daughter of marriageable age. In fact, she sort of competes with her daughter for the eligible men, rather than putting the hopes for her own future in the hands of her relatives or her daughter, like most women her age seem to do. Part of Lady Susan's charm and power is that she can tempt a younger man like Reginald de Courcy. She can flirt her way into a favorable second marriage that still gives her power, rather than ceding her power to someone else. So, like many of the mean girls who are much younger than her, Lady Susan uses the marriage market to achieve financial security for herself and herself alone. Why doesn't she simply do her best to secure a home through a successful marriage for Frederica? I think this mostly has to do with Lady Susan's inflated sense of self and underestimation of Frederica's advantages. I don't think that Lady Susan acknowledges that her daughter might be able to make a financially successful match. She doesn't see her as an ally, she sees her as competition. And even if Frederica did secure a prosperous marriage, I think Lady Susan understands that she would then be dependent on her daughter. And Lady Susan Vernon is too used to power and manipulation to simply let herself become dependent to anyone. And in some ways, that's what all of these women do. They manipulate and scheme and belittle others in order to assert their own dominance and to find power in a society that has marginalized them. The younger mean girls in Claudia's video are mostly, with the exception of Mrs. Elton, searching for power and financial security through marriage. Interestingly enough, these older women have already found that security, but they realize that it's fleeting. Most of these women are widows who need to look to a new source of power and security, or they're married, but they feel threatened somehow. And I think that Mrs. Elton, though she's young and newly married, falls into this category. She feels a sense of self-importance, and she's threatened by Emma's position in Highbury and her former claim on her husband's heart. Similarly to the way Mrs. Churchill is threatened by the relationship of Frank and his birth parent, or that Fanny Dashwood feels threatened by the relationship of the extended family. In many ways, these women can be seen as simply taking an active role in their fate and looking out for their futures and legacies. Though I personally condemn the way most of these women achieve this goal by limiting other women's prospects and generally belittling others to raise themselves. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on the mean old broads in Jane Austen, or rather the manipulative and meddling women in Austen's works. What do you think of these characters and their motivations? Are there any other characters that you feel would fit into this category that I didn't mention? Do you think that these characters are redeemable in any way? Do you admire them, condemn them, or like me, do you feel a little bit of both? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and I'd just like to thank Claudia for encouraging me to make this video. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!